I've been thinking lately about getting a T-shirt made up that says Black Lives Matter, and underneath it would be a little thing in parenthesis, all of them, in close parenthesis, because as we've discussed here on the program, if white and Asian and Hispanic lives don't matter as well as black lives, and black lives don't matter because it's a collective proposition here of all humans having a net worth. And as soon as you try to excise one from the other, then you're in trouble. But it is the excising that creates that old dialectic we're always talking about here on the show, pitting one group against another, which has been a real popular topic of the Marxist left for over 50 years. Welcome to Steel on Steel. John Lefter here with you. I want to talk about the roots of Black Lives Matter. And the reason is, in looking at what we've seen go on here over the last year, for those of us like myself who cut our teeth at places like KCBS News Radio in San Francisco, I still say it like I was there. I was there in the late 60s when we had everything going on at Berkeley and San Francisco State. You had the Black Panthers and Huey Newton and the Weather Underground and names like Angela Davis. And I could just crank them all off here. Okay, Malcolm X, the whole bit. And looking at the Black Lives Matter movement, here we are 60 years later, and it's all the same thing, or maybe 50 years later. So what is the dynamic that underlies these? Jim Simpson is an economist, businessman, and investigative journalist. He writes for Accuracy in Media. They're known as AIM at AIM.org, as well as the American Thinker, Washington Times, and WorldNet Daily, and Breitbart, and was formerly an analyst in the White House Office of Management and Budget. He wrote an article, Reds Exploiting Blacks, the Roots of the Black Lives Matter Movement. And Jim, I thought it was really time to do this here in the middle of the summer to put some perspective on everything that we have heard now that we've gotten past the Republican and Democratic conventions, of which there was much truck made in the Democratic convention. The illusion that's created is that the Black Lives Matter movement, or any of these movements, are a, quote, spontaneous, end quote, eruption of people's protesting something or other. But in reality, there are shadow groups working right underneath them, fueling them and funding them. So let's talk about that. Why don't you give us some backgrounder?
Yeah, well, absolutely. Great to be with you, and thanks for having me on. You know, when a group comes out and automatically draws a conclusion about an event, for example, the Ferguson shooting of Michael Brown, and then goes on to launch what turned into a very violent and destructive protest based on this presumption of guilt, which we later find out to be just a totally fallacious presumption. It's invariably a project of the radical left. It is invariably something that has been organized to create a narrative regardless of what the facts are. And that's what the left specializes in. They specialize in creating a false narrative in order to exploit divisions in our society and foment divisions when they're not there and exacerbate them when they are there, because that's how they insinuate themselves into positions of power. And that's what they're really all about. That's what the left has always been about. It's about insinuating itself into positions of power and wealth, and note that doing so without providing any kind of productive contribution to society, but rather to ensconce themselves into positions of power while at the same time tearing our society apart. That's the left's entire agenda, and it doesn't matter if you're talking about race relations, if you're talking about the environment, if you're talking about civil rights, if you're talking about voting. Pick any issue. To the left, the issue is never the issue. The issue is always the revolution, and the revolution to them is giving them absolute power. And they've been working that same program since, well, you mentioned the 60s, but it's actually been since the turn of the last century.
Yeah, go back to the beginning of the 1900s. I agree with that. But we really saw it here in this country as soon as we began to see the Flower Child Revolution, as it was called, in the 1960s. And recall, even back then, Jim, especially in the San Francisco Bay Area, they were saying, oh, we're all about love and peace and giving each other a flower. But at the very same time, they were calling the police pigs and spitting on vets coming back from Vietnam. So that dissonance is always there. You know, you can always see it in these movements.
Yes, always there.
Okay, next question. Before we get to some of the shadow organizations behind BLM, say gay rights organizations. There's been a few leaks now that we've discovered that the real hardcore leftists inside the Democratic, they really look upon the gay groups with contempt. And if your theory is right, if supporting gay rights no longer serve their issue, they drop them like a hot potato and move on to some other group. Is that a fair assessment?
Oh, yeah. Well, the gay rights movement was created by the same crowd for the same purpose. I mean, I've done a video called Cultural Terrorism, and anybody that wants to can go to YouTube and just look it up. Cultural terrorism. They conceived sexual license as a wonderful way to undermine Christian morality that is the cement that formed our country and made it the great country that it is. And since they are about destroying this country, undermining this country, and turning it to their purposes, Christianity, more than anything else, was a major roadblock and had to be undermined and destroyed. And people say, oh, well, that just sounds like a silly conspiracy theory. Well, no, actually it's not. It was articulated by early Marxists and Marxists who subsequently came to the United States fleeing Germany and set up shop at the Columbia Teachers College.
You're talking about the Frankfurt School.
I'm talking about the Frankfurt School. One of them, Herbert Marcuse, wound up at the University of California, San Diego, where, to go back to your earlier point, throwing back to the 1960s, he mentored Angela Davis, and among other things. And he wrote a book called Eros and Civilization, where he advocated for polymorphous sexuality. And he's the man who has, rightly or wrongly, been tagged as the creator of the slogan, "Make love, not war." So it's all the same thing. It's all comes from the same source. It's all about exploiting divisions. It's all about creating divisions where divisions didn't exist. It's all about turning us against each other. It's a sophisticated form of divide and conquer. That's what it is.
Yeah, it's as Saul Alinsky said, friction makes the whole thing work. He said that in an interview with National Public Radio back in 1972. And so you have to create the friction, because then when everybody's all up and down, they're willing to move along a continuum they wouldn't be otherwise willing to do. And that's what does it. So let's look at the multiple levels. I'll draw down some. First of all, you've got, when you talk about the left, whenever I think about the hardcore left, I'm thinking about the progressive neo-Marxist real ideologues, the ones who believe that.
Right.
Not talking about the average Democrat you may work next to at the workplace.
Exactly.
And so those people get drawn along. And college students are really subject to this, all right? They're gullible as gullible. They get drawn along by this stuff and are unaware of the lower level Schicht that they use in geology, the lower level stratum that's going on. All right, so if we take Black Lives Matter, what organizations are underneath them? Where are they deriving their push and their funding?
Well, first of all, you look at the founders, who are generally agreed to be Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opel Tometi, all three of whom work for organizations of the Freedom Road Socialist Organization, and that is a evolutionary offshoot of the new communist movement inspired by Mao Zedong. And they've been around since the 80s, and they focus on race issues. They also focus on gay rights issues. For example, two of the three are what they describe themselves as queer black women, and the Freedom Road organization is heavily involved in the gay issue, all aspects of the gay issue. But they've all worked, they work now and all have worked for one or more of the many organizations under the Freedom Road Socialist Organization umbrella. So, for example, Alicia Garza is the Special Projects Director of the National Domestic Workers Alliance. That is a Freedom Road organization. She's the Executive Director of another one called People Organized to Win Employment Rights, with the acronym POWER. She's a board member of the School of Unity and Liberation, acronym SOUL, and other organizations, which are all Freedom Road socialist organizations, all receiving money from a universe of leftist foundations. The most familiar ones are, of course, George Soros, Ford Foundation, Marguerite Casey. Ben & Jerry's supports a lot of these organizations that they work for, interestingly enough. So if you're going to get ice cream, think twice about buying Ben & Jerry's, because their profits, some of their profits, go into their foundation, and their foundation uniformly funds the radical left in this country. Each one of these organizations is small, but when you put them together, they have millions and millions of dollars backing them.
Exploiting blacks to promote the Marxist revolution of the hardcore progressive Marxist elitist is an old tactic going back a century, but really coming to its ascendancy back in the 1960s. We're talking to Jim Simpson right now from AIM.org. We're at SteelOnSteel.com. I'm John Lefter. The program is Steel on Steel. Goal of politics is to win. It is a blood sport. Wear a cup because it gets rough and tumble, even in democratic societies. And if the goal is to win, then you use whatever means to win that you can, even if lying, half-truths, and deception is the name of the game, which, of course, is what happens in all warfare. So why should we be surprised? And what politicians rely upon is the fact that people forget from day to day what it is they said yesterday, and you won't hold it against them. And of course, that's what the media would be all about. But the media now have been acting as lapdogs for various political causes, which is why there is an alternative media. Welcome back to Steel on Steel. John Lefter here with you. That's not necessarily good, because what we've done now is, rather than having two people representing different sides of an issue challenging each other, where you can hear the ideas hashed out, very much like Proverbs 27:17, is iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another. People tend to watch what reinforces their own worldview, what they want to believe. And even when that is faulty, they don't hear the contradicting evidence because the media are not honestly presenting it. What we try to be here is the antidote to that by saying, well, this is what they're saying. Now, here's the counter movement to that, for those who are listening. Jim Simpson is our guest right now. What I wanted to do, because I've been watching the whole controversy, Black Lives Matter, all of them, and why is it, say, for example, the BLM movement refuses to look at the issue of black-on-black homicides, 6,000 a year or something like that in this country, and hyper-focuses on the police issue when statistics don't even bear it. If you go to the underlying dialectic they're trying to inject here, because the narrative being spun now supports the division, supports the strife, supports the controversy. Admitting the truth, putting this in perspective, would change the whole thing, and they would lose that driving engine. And that's why they will not have that honest conversation they talk about all the time, because it would destroy the narrative. And that's what I wanted to examine, is how, if you look going all the way back 50 or 60 years, the same faces or their descendants keep popping up behind the scenes. And when you begin to put the network connections together, then you understand something different is afoot. Jim Simpson's my guest right now. He wrote an article, Reds Exploiting Blacks, The Roots of Black Lives Matter, for AIM.org. Now, you mentioned several different organizations here, and I want to show how a relatively few number of organizations, mostly unfamiliar to most Americans, are actually driving any one of these various so-called spontaneous eruptions of protest or whatever. You identified the one you just did, Freedom Road Socialist Organizations, and you said that's one of the four largest of the really what I call the Marxist left groups in the country. The other